Isabella had always known her father's gambling would destroy them, but she never imagined he would sell her to the most feared lord in England to pay his debts. They called him the Shadow Lord, and no woman who entered his manor was ever seen smiling again. The carriage rattled through Yorkshire rain as Isabella clutched her worn Bible, the only possession her father had allowed her to keep. 3 days since he'd sealed her fate for 30 pieces of silver, and still he couldn't meet her eyes. The debt to Lord Adrian Blackthorne had consumed everything: their house, lands, servants, everything except Isabella herself, the final payment in her father's ruin. "You should have married Lord Hamilton," her father muttered, avoiding her gaze. Isabella said nothing. She had refused Hamilton because she'd seen him strike a servant girl for spilling wine. If that made her stubborn, so be it. Ravenshollow Manor rose from the moors like a Gothic nightmare. Black stone walls stretched toward grey skies, narrow windows watching her approach like malevolent eyes. Gargoyles perched on every corner, faces twisted in permanent screams. This fortress would be her prison. Lord Adrian Blackthorne waited at the entrance, and Isabella's breath caught. Younger than expected, perhaps 30, with broad shoulders and battle-scarred hands. Coal-black hair pulled severely back from a face that might have been handsome before whatever darkness had claimed his soul, but his eyes made her blood freeze, pale grey like winter storms, devoid of warmth or mercy. Her father practically fell from the carriage. "Lord Blackthorne, I present my daughter Isabella, exactly as agreed." Lord Adrian's predatory gaze swept over Isabella like she was livestock at market. She forced herself to stand straight, meeting those terrible eyes with dignity. She'd been raised as a lady, educated in 4 languages, taught music and art. None of it mattered now. She was payment for a debt. "She appears healthy enough," Lord Adrian said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "The debt was considerable, Morrison. £3,000. I trust she understands her service here." Her father nodded frantically. "She knows her duty, my lord. Well-educated, can read, write, speak French." "I didn't ask for her qualifications," Lord Adrian interrupted coldly. "I asked if she understands why she's here." Those pale eyes focused on Isabella. "Do you understand, girl?" Isabella lifted her chin with a surge of courage drawn from reserves she didn't even know she possessed, meeting his penetrating stare with a directness that surprised them both. "I understand perfectly that my father's gambling addiction and moral weakness have made me your property, Lord Blackthorne. I understand that I am here to serve whatever purposes you deem appropriate, for however long you require." Her voice trembled only slightly on the final words, a small but significant victory in the face of this overwhelming defeat of everything she had once been. Something indefinable flickered in those winter storm eyes for just an instant. Surprise, perhaps, or possibly approval at her unexpected show of spine. Maybe it was simply amusement at her pathetic attempt at dignity in such degrading circumstances. "Indeed," he said with finality that seemed to echo off the stone walls around them. He gestured with casual authority to a stern-faced woman who had appeared at his side like a shadow made flesh. "Mrs. Hartwell will escort you to your quarters and explain the household rules. You begin your duties tomorrow at dawn without exception." As Isabella curtsied with the grace drilled into her since childhood and turned to follow the forbidding housekeeper, she heard Lord Adrian's voice behind her, addressed to her father with the kind of deadly softness that promised swift and terrible consequences. "Your debt is now fully settled, Morrison. Our business is concluded permanently. If you darken my doorstep again for any reason whatsoever, if you even set foot on my lands, it will be the last mistake you ever make in this life. Am I perfectly understood?" Her father's terrified whisper of agreement was the last sound Isabella heard as the manor's massive doors closed behind her with the finality of a tomb ceiling, locking away her old life forever. Mrs. Hartwell led her through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly into shadow and silence, their footsteps echoing hollowly off walls lined with portraits of stern ancestors, whose painted eyes followed Isabella's progress with expressions of deep disapproval. Suits of medieval armour stood at attention in stone alcoves, their empty visors seeming to track her movement like the hollow gaze of ancient ghosts. The very air of this place felt heavy with centuries of secret sorrow and suffering that had soaked into the stones themselves. "Rule number 1, Mrs. Hartwell intoned without turning around, her voice bouncing off the stone walls with sepulchral authority. "Never speak to his lordship unless he addresses you directly first. Rule number 2, never enter his private chambers without explicit written permission. Rule number 3. She paused dramatically at a heavy wooden door carved with intricate roses and thorns that seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight. Never ask about his scars. Never mention the war. Never speak of his family or what happened to them. Never question why certain rooms remain locked. Is that absolutely clear? Yes, ma'am, Isabella whispered, though her mind raced with the forbidden questions that Mrs. Hartwell's warnings had only served to kindle. What scars? What had happened in the war that haunted him so? What family had he lost? What secrets lay behind those locked doors? Her assigned room was small but surprisingly clean, furnished with a narrow bed that had clearly seen better decades, a chipped ceramic wash basin, and a single tall window that looked out over the manor's once magnificent gardens now gone wild with decades of neglect. Twisted trees reached skeletal branches toward the grey sky, while thorny vines strangled the remains of what had once been carefully tended flower beds. As Mrs. Hartwell left her alone with a single guttering candle and strict instructions to be ready for service at the first light of dawn, Isabella sank onto the hard mattress and finally allowed herself to weep openly for the first time since this nightmare had begun. She cried bitter tears for the life she'd lost, for the father who had betrayed every bond of blood and love for the sake of his addiction, for the uncertain and terrifying future that stretched before her like an endless corridor of shadows. But as her tears gradually dried and the candle burned dangerously low, Isabella made a decision that would ultimately change the course of both their lives forever. She would not be broken by this place or by this man who thought gold could purchase her soul along with her body. She would survive whatever trials lay ahead, and somehow, some way, she would find a path back to freedom and dignity. Through her frost-covered window she could see golden light burning in the manor's tallest tower, where Lord Adrian presumably sat in his private chambers, perhaps planning her fate or wrestling with demons of his own. Let him plot and scheme, she thought with newfound steel in her spine. He might own her body and command her service, but her spirit, her hope, her essential self would remain forever beyond his reach. Dawn arrived with cruel swiftness, bringing with it the sharp sound of Mrs. Hartwell's authoritative knock echoing through the thin wooden door. "His lordship expects you in the library in precisely 10 minutes, she announced with military precision. "Wear the grey dress and white apron I've left folded on your chair. Remember, punctuality is not merely expected, it is absolutely required. The rules I explained yesterday are not suggestions to be considered, but commands to be obeyed without question." The grey woolen dress was simple but well made, marking her new station in the household hierarchy as clearly as if she wore shackles around her wrists. The white apron tied around her waist completed the transformation from lady to servant. In the cracked mirror above her wash basin, Isabella barely recognised the reflection staring back at her. Yesterday she had been Miss Isabella Morrison, a gentleman's daughter who had simply fallen on temporary hard times. Today she was... what exactly? A bondservant? A slave in all but name? She pushed the disturbing thoughts away and focused on the immediate task of survival. The library proved to be the most magnificent room Isabella had ever seen. Its soaring walls lined floor to ceiling with thousands of leather-bound volumes that seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Sunlight streamed through tall, mullioned windows that overlooked the wild gardens, illuminating dancing dust motes and casting golden rectangles across the Persian rugs that covered polished oak floors. Lord Adrian stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the morning light like a figure from a romantic painting, though there was nothing romantic about the rigid tension in his broad shoulders, or the way his scarred hands gripped the window frame. "You will catalogue and organise these books according to my specifications," he said, without turning around, his voice as cold and impersonal as winter stone. "Philosophy and theology first, then literature arranged by country and century, followed by histories, scientific treatises, and finally the more esoteric volumes on the higher shelves. Mrs. Hartwell informs me that you can read adequately." It wasn't really a question, but Isabella answered anyway with careful politeness. "Yes, my lord. I can read fluently in English, French, Italian, and Latin, with some understanding of Greek and German as well." She had spent countless hours in her father's library before his gambling had forced them to sell even their books, and literature had always been her greatest passion and escape from an increasingly difficult world. Adequate, he said with dismissive curtness that stung more than it should have. You will also manage the extensive estate correspondence. As my previous secretary proved, unreliable. The ledgers are in complete disarray, and there are dozens of unanswered letters from tenants, solicitors, and business associates that require immediate attention. There was something ominous in the way he spoke of his former secretary, but Isabella didn't dare inquire about what had happened to the man. I assume your penmanship meets acceptable standards. Yes, my lord. I was trained by the same master who taught the daughters of the Earl of Pembroke. It was a small point of pride that she couldn't help but mention, a reminder of the world she had lost. For the first time since her arrival, Lord Adrian turned to face her directly, and Isabella had to summon every ounce of her willpower not to step backward in instinctive fear. Up close, she could see that the network of scars on his left hand extended up his arm, disappearing beneath the fine fabric of his white shirt like a map of old pain and violence. His face was a masterpiece of controlled power and bitter experience, all sharp angles and harsh lines that spoke of a man who had seen too much of life's cruelty. But there was something else there too, something that flickered behind those winter eyes like a banked fire, a loneliness so profound it made her heart contract with unexpected sympathy. You're remarkably composed for someone in your circumstances, he observed, studying her face with the intense focus of a natural philosopher examining a particularly interesting specimen. Most young women would be weeping hysterically or begging for mercy by now. Yet you stand there meeting my eyes as if you were still the lady of the manor rather than a servant paying her father's debts. Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced her voice to remain level and respectful. Hysteria serves no useful purpose, my lord. I am here now, and this is my situation whether I rage against it or accept it with grace. I have chosen to make the best of circumstances I cannot change. The words came out stronger than she had intended, carrying a note of defiance that surprised them both. Have you indeed? There was genuine curiosity in his voice now, the first real emotion she had heard from him since her arrival. Something in his tone made her think of a man who had forgotten what courage looked like in others, because he had seen so little of it directed toward himself. Even knowing what everyone in the village says about me, even knowing the stories they tell about the Shadow Lord and what becomes of women who enter his domain, Isabella lifted her chin another degree, meeting his penetrating gaze with a directness that would have been considered scandalous in her former social circle. With the greatest respect, my lord, I know nothing about you except village rumours and servants' gossip. In my experience, such stories usually tell us more about the fears and prejudices of those who spread them than about the people they supposedly describe. I prefer to judge individuals by their actions rather than their reputation. The silence that followed her bold statement seemed to stretch between them like a bridge neither was entirely certain they should cross. Lord Adrian studied her face intently, searching for some sign of deception or hidden calculation, some evidence of the fear or disgust he clearly expected to find. But Isabella had meant every word she had spoken. Whatever this man had done in his past, whatever darkness haunted his present, she would not condemn him based on whispered stories and village superstition. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded curtly and turned back toward the tall windows. Begin with the philosophy section in the northwest corner, he instructed with renewed coldness, as if her unexpected response had made him retreat behind his carefully constructed walls. Mrs. Hartwell will bring your meals at the prescribed hours. You're not to leave this room during your working hours without my explicit permission. As he moved toward the heavy oak door, Isabella surprised herself by speaking again. My lord? He paused without turning round, his broad shoulders tensing as if preparing for an attack. Yes, Miss Morrison. The use of her surname rather than girl felt like a small but significant acknowledgement of her humanity. My father's debt to you. Might I inquire how long I must serve to repay the full amount? This time he did turn around, and for just a moment Isabella thought she glimpsed something that might almost have been gentleness in those winter storm eyes. Your father owed me £3,000, Miss Morrison, a very considerable sum that represented years of accumulated losses at cards, dice, and horse racing. However, he paused, and his voice carried a note of what might have been reassurance. You are not my property, regardless of what he may have told you to ease his own conscience. You are in my employ, bound by honour and necessity rather than ownership. When your faithful service has repaid what he owed, you will be entirely free to leave this place and make whatever life you choose for yourself. and with those unexpected words of hope, he was gone, leaving Isabella alone among the thousands of ancient books, wondering if she had just imagined the softness in his voice when he spoke of her eventual freedom. Perhaps, she thought as she approached the first dusty shelf of philosophical treatises, the Shadow Lord was not quite the heartless monster that village legend had painted him to be. Perhaps there was more to his story than anyone knew, including himself. The first week passed in monotony. Isabella organised neglected books in the magnificent library, while Lord Adrian appeared briefly each morning, formal and distant. Mrs. Hartwell brought meals at precise intervals. The other staff treated her with polite uncertainty, clearly more educated than typical servants, but obviously there against her will. During her second week, Isabella discovered the locked room. Carrying historical volumes, she noticed a door hidden behind a tapestry, bearing elaborate locks. More intriguingly, she heard faint piano music from within, a melancholy melody that spoke of profound loss. Miss Morrison? Lord Adrian's sharp voice made her jump. His face was darker than she'd ever seen it, something dangerous in his pale eyes. You appear to have lost your way. I apologise, my lord. I was looking for the literature section. In future, confine yourself to prescribed routes. This wing is strictly forbidden to all staff. His warning made her skin prickle. I trust I make myself clear, but she couldn't forget that haunting melody, or the raw pain that flickered across his face when he found her there. The answer began to reveal itself during her third week, when a violent thunderstorm trapped them both in the library much later than usual. Isabella had been working by lamplight, cataloguing a collection of Renaissance poetry, when the first crash of thunder shook the ancient windows in their frames. Rain began hammering against the glass with tropical intensity, and she realised that running across the courtyard to her quarters would leave her soaked to the skin. Lord Adrian had been reading in his favourite chair by the fireplace, but the storm seemed to affect him strangely. Isabella noticed that he grew increasingly agitated with each lightning flash, his hands gripping his book so tightly that his knuckles went white. When a particularly violent thunderclap rattled the entire manor, he actually started violently and dropped the volume he had been holding. "My lord? Are you quite well?" The concern in her voice was genuine and instinctive. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, and she was shocked by the vulnerability she glimpsed in his face before his usual mask slammed back into place. "I am perfectly fine, Miss Morrison. The weather is simply inconvenient." But his voice lacked its usual authority, and she noticed that his scarred hands were trembling slightly. Another lightning flash illuminated the room with stark white light, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to come from directly overhead. This time Lord Adrian actually flinched and muttered something under his breath that sounded like a name. Catherine, spoken with such anguish that Isabella felt her heart constrict with sympathy. Without thinking, she set down her work and approached his chair, moving slowly as she might approach a wounded animal. "The storm will pass soon," she said gently, keeping her voice soft and reassuring. "These autumn tempests always seem worse than they are." He looked up at her with eyes that held more pain than any person should have to bear. For a moment, the careful walls he had built around himself seemed to crumble, and she saw the broken man beneath the lordly facade. "You should return to your quarters," he said, but there was no force behind the command, only weariness. "I couldn't possibly reach my room without being drenched, my lord. Perhaps I might continue working here until the worst of it passes." She settled back at her desk without waiting for permission, sensing that he needed company more than solitude, even if he would never admit it. They worked in comfortable silence for the next hour, the only sounds the steady rhythm of rain against windows and the occasional scratch of Isabella's pen as she made notes in the catalogue. Gradually she noticed that Lord Adrian's tension began to ease, his breathing becoming more regular as the storm moved off toward the east. She pretended to be completely absorbed in her work, but she was acutely aware of his presence, of the way the firelight played across his stern features and highlighted the silver threads that were beginning to appear at his temples despite his relative youth. "Miss Morrison." His voice was softer than she had ever heard it, almost hesitant. "I must ask you to forget what you witnessed here tonight. The storm sometimes affects me in ways that are inappropriate for a man in my position." Isabella looked up from her catalogue, meeting his gaze directly. "I witnessed nothing unusual, my lord. Simply a gentleman caught by surprise by the weather, as was I. Her voice carried no judgment, only quiet understanding. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, at her diplomatic response, or maybe gratitude for her discretion. "You are kind to say so." It was the first time he'd ever acknowledged her as anything other than a servant fulfilling her duties, and the simple word kind, spoken with such obvious sincerity, made her heart flutter in a way she didn't entirely understand. From that night forward, their relationship began to change in subtle but significant ways. Lord Adrian still maintained his formal distance during working hours, but Isabella sometimes caught him watching her with an expression that was more thoughtful than coldly assessing. He began asking for her opinions about certain books and seemed genuinely interested in her responses rather than simply testing her knowledge. Once, when she made an insightful comment about a particularly complex philosophical argument, she was rewarded with what might almost have been a smile, the first she had ever seen cross his face. The breakthrough came during her 4th week, when Isabella discovered something that would change everything between them. She had been organising a collection of personal papers that Lord Adrian had finally decided to sort through, when she came across a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. The writing was feminine, and though she tried not to read the private correspondence, one line caught her eye as she was determining where to file them. "My dearest Adrian, the baby grows stronger every day, and I know that when you return from this terrible war, we shall be the happiest family in all of England." The words hit her like a physical blow. A wife, a child, the family that Mrs. Hartwell had warned her never to mention. Her hands trembled as she realised the magnitude of the loss that haunted this house, the tragedy that had transformed whatever man Adrian had been before the war into the Shadow Lord of village legend. She was still staring at the letter in shock when Lord Adrian entered the library unexpectedly. The moment he saw what she held in her hands, his face went deathly pale, then flushed with a rage so intense that Isabella instinctively stepped backward. "Put that down immediately." His voice was deadly quiet, more terrifying than if he had shouted, "You have no right to read private correspondence." "My lord, I wasn't reading it. I was simply trying to organise," Isabella began, but he cut her off with a gesture that was pure violence barely contained. "I said put it down." He moved toward her with predatory grace, and for the first time since her arrival, Isabella felt genuine fear. This was the man the villagers whispered about, the one who had returned from the war broken and dangerous. "Those letters are not for your eyes or anyone else's." Isabella carefully placed the bundle on the desk, her hands shaking with a combination of fear and profound sympathy. "I'm truly sorry, my lord. I had no intention of prying into your private affairs. I was only trying to sort the papers as you requested." Lord Adrian snatched up the letters with such violence that the blue ribbon snapped, scattering the precious pages across the floor. As he scrambled to collect them, Isabella saw something that made her heart break. Tears streaming down his face, the first emotion other than anger or coldness she had ever witnessed from him. "Get out," he whispered, not looking at her as he clutched the scattered letters to his chest like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. "Get out, and don't come back today." Isabella fled from the library, but she couldn't flee from the image burned into her memory. The mighty Lord Adrian Blackthorne on his knees, weeping over love letters from a wife who would never write to him again. She spent the rest of the day in her small room, staring out at the overgrown gardens and thinking about the profound loneliness that must fill every corner of this vast manor. The next morning she approached the library with deep trepidation, uncertain of what reception awaited her. Lord Adrian stood at the windows as usual, but his posture was different, less rigid, more defeated. When he turned to face her, she was shocked by how much older he looked, as if reliving those memories had aged him years in a single night. "Miss Morrison," he said quietly, and his voice held none of yesterday's rage, only a bone-deep weariness. "I owe you an apology for my behaviour yesterday. You were simply doing your assigned tasks, and I reacted poorly." "No apology is necessary, my lord," Isabella replied softly. "I can only imagine how difficult it must be to revisit painful memories." He studied her face for a long moment, as if searching for signs of pity or condescension. Finding neither, he nodded slowly. "Perhaps you can at that. You've lost much yourself, haven't you? Your home, your position in society, your future as you once imagined it." It was the first time he had acknowledged her own losses, and Isabella felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared suffering perhaps, or simply the beginning of genuine understanding. "We all carry our scars, my lord. Some are simply more visible than others." "Indeed." He was quiet for a long moment, then spoke again with obvious difficulty. "Her name was Catherine. My wife. We had been married only 18 months when I left for the peninsula. She was expecting our first child when I received my commission." Isabella remained perfectly still, sensing that he needed to speak these words aloud, perhaps for the first time since his return. She made no sound that might break the spell of his confession. "I was gone for 3 years," he continued, his voice growing rougher with each word. 3 years of battles and blood and watching good men die for causes they didn't understand. I survived wounds that should have killed me, lived through sieges that broke stronger men than myself. Do you know what sustained me through all of it, Miss Morrison?" "Her letters," Isabella whispered. "Her letters," he confirmed. "Every week, without fail, she would write to tell me about our son. Yes, we had a son, Thomas. About his first steps, his first words, how he had my eyes but her gentle temperament. She wrote about the garden she was planning for my return, the improvements she wanted to make to the estate, the life we would build together when the war finally ended." Isabella felt tears prick her own eyes as she began to understand the magnitude of his loss. "What happened to them, my lord?" "Fever," he said simply, but the single word contained a universe of grief. A particularly virulent strain swept through the county during the winter of 1811. It took them both within a week of each other. Catherine first, then little Thomas 3 days later. His voice cracked on his son's name. "I didn't even know they were ill." "The letter telling me of their deaths took 2 months to reach me in Spain." The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of grief that had been carried alone for too many years. Isabella understood now why certain rooms remained locked, why music sometimes drifted from empty chambers, why storms affected him so deeply. This entire manor was a mausoleum, a shrine to a life that had died while he was an ocean away, fighting someone else's war. "I came home to find their bodies already buried, their belongings already packed away by well-meaning relatives," Lord Adrian continued with bitter precision. "The nursery was empty. The gardens Catherine had planned were overgrown with weeds, and I was already dead inside. The man who had left for war no longer existed. In his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who felt nothing but rage at a world that could steal everything good while leaving the broken pieces behind." "But you survived," Isabella said gently. "You came home. You rebuilt the estate, maintained the lands, cared for your tenants. That takes tremendous strength." He laughed, but there was no humour in the sound. "Strength? No, Miss Morrison. What you call strength, I call cowardice. A truly strong man would have found a way to live again, to honour their memory by creating new happiness. I simply existed. I withdrew from the world, drove away anyone who tried to reach me, and convinced myself that isolation was preferable to risking such pain again." "And now?" Isabella asked softly. Lord Adrian turned to look at her fully, and she was startled by the intensity in his pale grey eyes. "Now I find myself wondering if perhaps complete isolation isn't the answer after all." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "You don't fear me, Miss Morrison. You don't flinch when I speak harshly or make demands. You look at me as if I'm simply a man, not a monster. Do you have any idea how long it's been since someone looked at me that way?" Isabella felt her heart begin to beat faster, sensing they were approaching dangerous territory. "You're simply a man, my lord. A man who has suffered greatly, but still a man capable of kindness, of growth, of happiness, if you would allow yourself to seek it." "Happiness," he repeated the word as if it were foreign to him. "I'm not certain I remember what that feels like, or if I deserve to feel it again." "Everyone deserves happiness," Isabella said with quiet conviction, "even those who believe they forfeited the right to it through their mistakes or losses." They stood looking at each other across the library that had become their shared world, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. The formal barrier of master and servant was still there, but it had developed cracks that neither could ignore. Lord Adrian was no longer the untouchable Shadow Lord of village legend, and Isabella was no longer simply a girl paying her father's debts. They were two people who had recognized something essential in each other, something that might, with care and courage, grow into something more. "I should not be speaking to you this way," Lord Adrian said finally, but he made no move to leave or dismiss her. "It's inappropriate given our respective positions." "Perhaps," Isabella agreed, "but sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we shouldn't have." He almost smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his entire face and gave her a glimpse of the man he had been before war and loss had hardened him. "You are a remarkable young woman, Miss Morrison. Your father was a fool to risk losing you for the sake of his addiction." "My father lost himself long before he lost me," Isabella replied, "but perhaps some losses can lead to unexpected discoveries." "Perhaps they can," he agreed quietly, and in his voice she heard the first note of hope she had ever detected there. From that day forward, their relationship entered a new phase that was both exhilarating and terrifying for them both. Lord Adrian began spending more time in the library while Isabella worked, sometimes reading in his customary chair, but more often engaging her in conversations that range from literature to philosophy to their shared observations about human nature. He was, she discovered, one of the most intelligent men she had ever met, with insights shaped by experiences that had tested him in ways few people ever endured. For her part, Isabella found herself looking forward to their daily interactions with an anticipation that went far beyond mere politeness. She began choosing her dresses more carefully each morning, paying attention to how the lamplight caught the auburn highlights in her hair, wondering if Lord Adrian noticed such details. She told herself it was simply vanity, a natural feminine response to being the only woman in the house under the age of 50. But in her honest moments she knew it was something more dangerous. She was falling in love with a man who was so far above her station that even friendship was scandalous. The crisis came during her 7th week. Isabella arrived at the library to find Lord Adrian pale with shock, holding a letter with trembling hands. "Your father is dead, Miss Morrison," he said quietly. The news hit her like a blow, though not devastatingly. Her relationship with her father had died with his betrayal. How? Gaming house, new debts, dangerous creditors, when he couldn't pay. Adrian left the sentence unfinished. Isabella absorbed this with surprising calm. What does this mean for my situation? Legally, you're free to leave. The contract dies with him. You could walk out today owing nothing. And if I chose to stay? Something flickered in his grey eyes. Hope, perhaps. Why would you? You could return to London, find work as a governess. You're educated, capable of independence. Isabella took a breath, knowing her words would change everything. Because I don't want to leave. I found something here I never expected. A place where I feel needed, valued for my mind rather than endured as a burden. Isabella. Her name on his lips made her heart skip. You cannot understand what you're saying. If you stay, it won't be as a servant. That changes everything. I know. The scandal would ruin you. No respectable man would marry you after such association. I know. Adrian moved closer, close enough she could see gold flecks in his grey eyes. Then why? Why risk everything to stay in a place the world considers cursed? She met his gaze. Because I believe this house needs someone who sees past shadows to the light within. Because you need someone unafraid of your past. And because I've come to care for you far more than a servant should. Slowly, carefully, he cupped her face in his scarred hands. My dear, brave Isabella, do you know what you're saying? I know exactly what I'm giving up and what I'd be gaining. I am not the man I was before the war, he warned, thumbs tracing her cheeks. I carry scars deeper than what you see. I have nightmares, moments when the past feels more real than present. I am older, more cynical, damaged in ways that may never heal. And I am not the sheltered daughter I was 7 weeks ago, Isabella replied. I've learned that love isn't about perfection. The strongest connections are forged between people who understand suffering, who offer comfort without judgment. Love? Adrian repeated the word like something precious. Is that what you're offering me? If you want it, if someone like me could ever. He silenced her doubts with his lips, kissing her with tenderness that spoke of wonder and hope reborn. When they parted, she saw tears in his eyes, for the first time, tears of joy rather than grief. I love you, he said simply. I never thought I'd say those words again. Never imagined my heart could hold anything but loss. But you've awakened something I thought had died. I'm not trying to replace them, Isabella said quickly. I know they'll always hold part of your heart. I know. That's what makes you extraordinary. You understand that love doesn't diminish by being shared, that honouring the dead doesn't require abandoning life. Catherine would have liked you immensely." They held each other in the golden morning light of the library, two people who had found in each other something they had never expected to discover, a love that was all the stronger for having been born from loss and hardship. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, but inside their embrace, Isabella felt nothing but warmth and possibility. "What happens now?" she asked eventually, though she was reluctant to leave the sanctuary of his arms. "Now," Adrian said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "we face whatever consequences come together. We'll have to navigate the scandal, deal with the gossip, find a way to build a life that society will accept. It won't be easy." "The best things never are," Isabella replied with quiet confidence, "but I believe we're strong enough to face whatever challenges await us." "Together," Adrian agreed, and in that single word Isabella heard the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine, a future filled with love, purpose, and the gradual healing of two hearts that had found their way to each other through darkness and despair. As winter settled over Ravenshollow Manor, the house began showing signs of life. Adrian had locked rooms opened and aired, allowing sunlight to chase away lingering shadows. Isabella worked beside him, sorting through Catherine's belongings, helping decide what to keep as memories and what to donate to village families. The piano was tuned for the first time in a decade, Isabella's gentle playing filling halls with hopeful melodies. Overgrown gardens were reclaimed, paths cleared, flower beds prepared for spring planting they would do together. By spring's arrival, transformation was complete. The house looked brighter, windows cleaned for maximum light, rooms redecorated in warmer colours that welcomed rather than warned. More importantly, its master had transformed from the bitter Shadow Lord into a man capable of love and hope. On a perfect May morning, with apple blossoms scenting the air and larks singing in ancient oaks, Adrian and Isabella married in the village church. The ceremony was small but heartfelt, attended by neighbours brave enough to defy convention and household staff who had watched their love story unfold with delight. Standing at the altar, she in elegant ivory silk, he in finest black, they reflected on the unlikely journey bringing them to this moment. She had arrived as payment for debt, expecting hardship. He had retreated from the world after losing everything that made life worthwhile. Neither had imagined they would find in each other not just love, but deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly alive, to risk pain for joy's possibility, to trust tomorrow despite yesterday's losses, to believe even broken hearts could beat with renewed purpose. Their story became village legend, proof that love could conquer obstacles, and unlikely people could find redemption through genuine affection. But for Adrian and Isabella, their love story was simpler than legend and more precious than folklore. Two people who recognized something essential in each other, who chose courage over safety and trust over fear. Years later, when their children played in restored gardens and grandchildren listened wide-eyed to stories of the Shadow Lord and the brave woman who tamed his darkness, they remembered their beginning not as fairy tale but as testament to love's transformative power, love that sees beyond surfaces to touch eternal truth of the human heart. In the library where their love first took root, surrounded by books that witnessed their courtship and windows that framed first confessions, they would pause to marvel at the miracle of finding each other. Against all odds, despite every obstacle, two broken people had discovered that together they could create something beautiful and whole, a love story that would endure long after their voices joined the whispers of history echoing through Ravenshollow Manor's halls.